There is a question that neuroscientists have been quietly wrestling with for the last 30 years. Why is it that when one person watches a stranger cry, their own chest tightens, their eyes water, and their body prepares to comfort them, while another person watches the exact same stranger cry and feels absolutely nothing? Same species, same brain structures, same neurons, same evolutionary history, radically different responses. What is happening inside the human head that produces this extraordinary variation in the capacity to feel what another person feels? For most of history, we did not have the tools to answer this question. We speculated, we philosophized, we assigned moral labels. Good people had empathy, bad people did not, and that was the end of the story. But in the last 3 decades, brain imaging technology has advanced to the point where we can actually watch empathy happen in real time. We can see which regions activate when a person witnesses another person's suffering. We can measure the intensity. We can compare individuals across the entire spectrum of human emotional capacity. And what we have discovered is more disturbing, more fascinating, and more hopeful than anyone anticipated. By the end of this video, you will understand how empathy actually works inside the human brain, why some people are drowning in it and others cannot access it at all, how childhood, biology, culture, and experience shape the empathic system across the lifespan. And you will understand something even more important. Because the deepest finding in recent empathy research is not about the people who have too much or too little. It is about what all of us can do to protect, restore, and cultivate the very thing that makes us human. Let me begin with a distinction that will change how you understand every human interaction for the rest of your life. Empathy is not one thing, it is 3. For decades, popular culture has treated empathy as a single, unified quality. A person either has it or does not. A person is empathic or unempathic. The neuroscience has now made clear that this is completely wrong. Empathy has 3 distinct components. Each is generated by a different brain system. Each can exist without the others, and each has profoundly different implications for how a person moves through the world. The first component is affective empathy. This is what most people mean when they say the word empathy. It is the automatic, embodied experience of feeling what another person feels. When you see someone smile and something in you brightens without effort. When you see someone flinch in pain and your own body flinches with them. When someone across the room begins to cry and your own tears rise before you have even thought about the situation. This is affective empathy. It happens in a region of the brain called the anterior insula, with strong involvement of the anterior cingulate cortex. These structures fire without conscious control. You do not choose to feel affective empathy. It arrives, unbidden, whether you want it or not. The second component is cognitive empathy. This is the ability to understand what another person is thinking or feeling without necessarily sharing it. It is the empathy of the negotiator, the therapist, the interrogator, the strategist. Cognitive empathy is generated primarily by regions of the prefrontal cortex, the parts of the brain associated with thinking, planning, and mental modeling. It is a deliberate cognitive act. You look at another person, you construct a model of their inner state, and you use that model to predict their behavior. Cognitive empathy is what allows a skilled psychologist to understand a client's fears without becoming personally overwhelmed by them. It is what allows a talented teacher to see where a student is confused and adjust their explanation accordingly. It is a beautiful capacity when used ethically. But it is also, as we will see, the capacity that can be weaponized when it exists without its partners. The third component is compassionate empathy. This is the motivational component. It is the part of empathy that moves you from feeling to action. When you not only feel what someone feels, and not only understand what they need, but are moved to actually do something about it. Compassionate empathy involves regions of the brain associated with reward, motivation, and prosocial behavior. It links the emotional response to the behavioral response. It is what turns a feeling into a helping hand. Now here is where the picture gets interesting. A healthy, integrated person has all three. They feel what others feel, they understand what others need, and they are motivated to help. But most people are not equally balanced across the three. Almost everyone leans in one direction or another, and some individuals have one component at extremely high levels, while another is nearly absent. Understanding which combinations exist and what each combination produces in a human being is what unlocks the deepest insights of modern empathy research. Let me show you what I mean. Consider first the person who has extremely high affective empathy, but only average cognitive empathy. This is what many people mean when they use the modern term empath. These individuals feel other people's emotions so intensely that they often cannot distinguish them from their own. When a coworker is sad, they become sad. When a friend is anxious, they become anxious. When a stranger is in pain, they physically ache with it. They can walk into a room and immediately absorb the emotional atmosphere. They can watch the news and become genuinely destabilized by suffering happening thousands of miles away. This is not weakness. It is not oversensitivity. It is a neurologically real condition. Brain scans of high affective empathy individuals show significantly stronger activation in the anterior insula in response to others' emotional states. Their empathic system is simply more responsive than average. But this gift comes with a cost. Because these individuals absorb emotional states so easily, they are constantly at risk of being overwhelmed. They struggle with crowds. They struggle with conflict. They struggle to distinguish which feelings in their body are theirs and which are borrowed from the people around them. Without effective boundaries, they can spend their lives depleted, anxious, and confused about their own emotional truth. They can also, tragically, become magnets for people who exploit their empathy, because a high affective empathy person is naturally inclined to soothe distress in others. And a person who wants to be soothed endlessly without offering anything in return will find them irresistible. This is why so many high empathy individuals end up in relationships with Dark Triad partners. It is not because they are foolish or naive. It is because their empathic system is doing what it was designed to do. They see suffering, they move toward it, and they try to heal it. The problem is that some kinds of suffering cannot be healed by another person's love. Some kinds of suffering are designed, at the level of personality architecture, to consume every ounce of care offered and give nothing back. The high empathy person, without protective knowledge, walks into this dynamic again and again, not because they are broken, because the gift they carry has no built-in defense against the person who wants only to take. Now consider the opposite pattern: high cognitive empathy, but very low affective empathy. This is the combination that produces the personality type we discussed in a previous video, the dark empath. These individuals can read other people with extraordinary precision. They can see your fears, your motivations, your unspoken hopes. They can predict what you will do before you do it. They understand human psychology at a level most people cannot match. But they do not feel what you feel. When they see you cry, their own body does not respond. When they see you afraid, no fear rises in them. When they see you joyful, no answering joy blooms. They observe, they understand, they calculate, and what they do with that understanding depends entirely on their other traits. If a person with this profile also has strong, compassionate empathy, they can be extraordinarily effective at helping others. Great surgeons often have this profile, able to understand a patient's fear without becoming personally destabilized by it, and able to act with skill in situations where a high, effective empathy person would be paralyzed. Great crisis workers have it. Great strategists in humanitarian organizations have it. But if a person with high cognitive empathy has low compassionate empathy, if they can read people without feeling any motivation to help them, the same skill set becomes something else entirely. It becomes manipulation, predation, the ability to see straight into another person's soul and to use what they see for their own purposes. This is the disturbing implication of the neuroscience. Empathy in its cognitive form is not in itself a moral quality. It is a tool. And what a person does with the tool depends on what other qualities they possess. Cognitive empathy in the hands of a saint is a gift to the world. Cognitive empathy in the hands of a predator is a weapon of extraordinary precision. For most of history, we have not made this distinction. We have assumed that anyone who could understand us must, at some level, care about us. This assumption has cost more lives, more relationships, and more institutions than we can measure. Once you know that understanding and caring are separate systems in the brain, you never again mistake one for the other. Now consider the profile that concerns clinicians most. Very low affective empathy, very low compassionate empathy, and often, though not always, high cognitive empathy. This is the profile associated with the more severe forms of psychopathy. Brain imaging of individuals with this profile reveals striking abnormalities. The amygdala, the region responsible for emotional processing, particularly fear and emotional response, is measurably smaller and less active. The anterior insula, so responsive in high empathy individuals, remains relatively quiet even when the person witnesses graphic suffering. The prefrontal cortex, however, often functions normally or even at above average levels. The person can think clearly, plan strategically, and read others with skill. They simply do not feel the emotional resonance that most humans experience automatically. For decades, the debate raged over whether this profile was innate or developed. The current evidence suggests it is both. There appears to be a genetic contribution. Certain variations in genes related to neurotransmitter regulation are associated with higher risk. Twin studies suggest a heritability rate for psychopathic traits of somewhere between 40 and 70%, depending on the study. But genes are not destiny. A child born with these genetic risk factors who grows up in a warm, attuned, emotionally responsive environment often develops normally. The genetic predisposition is like dry brush. It only becomes a fire if a match is applied. The match, in most cases, is early childhood adversity of the specific types we discussed in the previous video. This is why the origins of severe empathy deficits are almost never purely biological or purely environmental. They are usually both. A vulnerable neurological substrate meets a hostile early environment, and the outcome is a brain that has learned, at the deepest level, not to resonate with the suffering of others. Not because it cannot, but because doing so in that early environment was too dangerous. The effective empathy system was, in a sense, deactivated as a protective measure. And once deactivated, it is extraordinarily difficult to reawaken. Extraordinarily difficult, but not, according to the most recent research, entirely impossible. We will return to this hope later. Now, if you have made it this far, you already understand more about empathy than most people who study it professionally. But the most important part of this video is coming next, because I have shown you 3 empathy profiles: high affective, low cognitive; high cognitive, low affective; low both. But I have not shown you the profile that most people actually have. Not the extremes, not the disorders, not the exceptional cases. The ordinary human. Because the ordinary human is not a maxed out empath and not a psychopath. The ordinary human sits somewhere in the middle, with all 3 empathy systems partially active, all 3 subject to environmental influence, and all 3 capable of being either strengthened or weakened across the lifespan. And what recent research has revealed about the empathy of the ordinary person is more important than anything I have said so far. Because it turns out that ordinary empathy is not a fixed trait. It is a muscle. And that muscle can be trained. It can also atrophy. Let me show you exactly how. The most important finding from the last decade of empathy research is that empathy is not stable. It is not something a person has at a certain level throughout their life. It moves. It shifts. It responds to what a person does, what a person is exposed to, and what a person practices. Meta-analyses of empathy across cultures have shown, alarmingly, that measurable empathy in the general population has been declining. Studies of college students, in particular, have shown drops of 30 to 40% in various measures of empathy over recent decades. This is not because young people are morally deficient. This is because the environment has changed. Human empathy evolved in small, face-to-face communities. It developed through direct, embodied contact with other suffering humans. It was cultivated by looking into eyes, hearing tones of voice, sitting with silence, being physically present with pain. Almost every one of those conditions has been eroded by modern life. We interact through screens. We witness suffering in the form of headlines rather than presence. We consume increasingly polarized media that trains us to view certain categories of humans as enemies rather than fellow feelers. We move faster. We sleep less. We practice presence rarely. Every one of these conditions weakens the empathy muscle. And a weakened empathy muscle changes not just how much we feel, but what we are capable of doing to others. Because empathy is the internal brake that prevents most humans from casually harming each other. When we can feel what another person would feel if we hurt them, we usually do not hurt them. When we cannot feel it, because the muscle has atrophied, the brake weakens. And the behaviors that follow are worse than they would have been if the empathy had been intact. This is not a hypothetical concern, it is measurable. Research has consistently shown that the more distance a person has from the person they are affecting, physical distance, emotional distance, categorical distance, the easier it is for them to inflict harm. This is why every ideology of atrocity throughout human history has begun with the same technique: dehumanization, convincing the population that the target group is not really human, that they do not feel the way we feel, that they do not love the way we love, that they do not suffer the way we suffer. Once empathy is disconnected, once the affective system stops firing in response to the target group, actions become possible that would have been unthinkable before. This is not ancient history. This is happening right now in cultures around the world. And it will keep happening in new forms in new places, as long as we fail to understand and protect the empathy systems that keep us human. But here is where the research turns hopeful. Because if empathy can atrophy, if it can be diminished by environment, exposure, and distance, then it can also be strengthened by the opposite conditions. And the neuroscience of empathy training has now identified specific practices that measurably restore empathic capacity, even in adults, and even in adults whose empathy had been significantly damaged. Let me share the most important of these. The first is the practice of embodied presence with suffering others. Not observing suffering through media, not reading about it, not analyzing it, being physically present with a suffering person, without distraction, without agenda, and without the impulse to fix. This is what visiting a sick friend does. This is what sitting with a grieving relative does. This is what volunteering in a shelter, a hospice, a soup kitchen does. The effective empathy system is activated by direct exposure. It requires the sight of the actual face, the sound of the actual voice, the presence of the actual body. Every time we substitute a screen for a face, we are training our empathy system to atrophy. Every time we replace mediated exposure with direct presence, we are training it to strengthen.
The second practice is deliberate perspective taking.
The cognitive empathy system responds to exercise. When we deliberately imagine what another person's experience must feel like, especially someone very different from ourselves, we activate and strengthen the prefrontal networks responsible for cognitive empathy. This is why reading literary fiction has been shown in multiple studies to increase empathy, because good literary fiction forces the reader to inhabit consciousness that is not their own, to temporarily see through eyes that see the world differently. It is also why deep conversation with people who differ from us, in background, in belief, in life experience, strengthens empathy in ways that surface conversation cannot. The mind is being exercised in the specific skill of modeling minds, unlike itself. The third practice is meditation, particularly compassion-based meditation. This has been one of the most striking findings of contemporary neuroscience. Meditative practices that involve extending goodwill toward others, sometimes called loving-kindness meditation, have been shown to produce measurable, lasting changes in the brain regions associated with empathy. Regular practitioners show increased activity in the anterior insula, increased connectivity between the empathic and motivational systems, increased responsiveness to the suffering of others across a wider range of categories. These changes have been demonstrated in weeks, not years. The empathy system is more plastic than we had understood. Even adults who have not practiced empathy in decades can rebuild it through deliberate cultivation. The fourth practice is emotional literacy. Empathy is enhanced by our ability to accurately identify emotions, first in ourselves, then in others. People who can name their own feelings with precision are measurably better at recognizing feelings in others. And people who cannot articulate their own inner world tend to be poor at articulating the inner worlds of the people around them. This is why journaling, therapy, and honest conversation with trusted others increases empathy. These practices train the emotional recognition system. They provide vocabulary. They allow subtle inner states to become visible and thus responsive. A person who does not know what they are feeling cannot easily know what you are feeling. But a person who has practiced knowing what they are feeling has, without intending to, become someone with a greater capacity to know you. Let me now speak to the deepest implication of everything I have shared. The world is currently, quietly, in the middle of an empathy crisis. Not because human beings have become worse, but because the conditions that develop and sustain empathy have been systematically eroded by the way we now live. Screens have replaced faces. Algorithms have replaced conversation. Ideological categories have replaced direct human contact. Speed has replaced presence. The specific practices that strengthen the empathy systems in the brain are practiced less and less by fewer and fewer people, in fewer and fewer contexts. The consequences of this erosion are visible everywhere, in the tone of public discourse, in the willingness to demonize opposing groups, in the ease with which harm is inflicted at a distance, in the rise of personality patterns that thrive on the atrophy of the empathic response. The Dark Triad personalities we have discussed throughout this series do not merely exist in individuals. They flourish or wither depending on the empathy climate of the surrounding culture. In a high empathy culture, they are recognized quickly and constrained by the surrounding tissue of feeling. Their manipulations do not work as well because too many people see through them. Their charm fails because too many people feel the coldness underneath. In a low empathy culture, they thrive. Their calibrated performances work on populations too disconnected to feel the wrongness. Their strategies succeed against opposition too atrophied to mount a coherent defense. The rise of empathy-eroding conditions in the modern world is not merely a personal tragedy for the individuals affected. It is a structural gift to the very personalities that most threaten collective flourishing. which means the cultivation of empathy in yourself, in your family, in your community, is not merely a personal ethical project. It is a defensive maneuver against a rising tide. Every hour you spend in embodied presence with another human being is an hour that strengthens the collective empathic capacity of our species. Every deep conversation across difference is a strike against the dehumanizing forces of the age. Every moment of genuine curiosity about another person's inner world is a small, quiet act of civilization repair. You cannot rebuild the empathy of the whole world, but you can rebuild yours, and the empathy of the people you touch, and the empathy of the children you influence, and the empathy of the culture you contribute to, one interaction at a time. Empathy is not a fixed inheritance from your childhood. It is a practice. And practice, over years, can transform even the most damaged empathic system into one capable of genuine feeling, genuine understanding, and genuine action. You are not stuck with what you were given. You get to build what you become. Let me leave you with one final thought. There is a phrase that has emerged in some recent empathy research. Researchers use it in the context of both individuals and cultures. Empathy is a garden. If you tend it with attention, with practice, with deliberate cultivation, it grows into something extraordinary. It produces beauty. It sustains connection. It nourishes both the gardener and everyone who walks through it. If you neglect it, if you let it be paved over by screens, hurried by pace, poisoned by ideological simplification, it withers. Not all at once, gradually, until one day the ground is bare and the person who was once capable of feeling deeply notices that they no longer feel much of anything. The garden does not tend itself, and no one else can tend it for you. But it also does not require perfection. It requires attention, consistency, a willingness to keep showing up day after day to the small acts that keep the empathic system alive. Look people in the eyes. Listen without preparing your response. Sit with someone in silence. Read what other minds have written. Practice, even briefly, the deliberate extension of goodwill toward others. Notice what you feel and name it clearly so that you can also notice what others feel. These are not grand gestures. They are the daily maintenance of the most important system inside you. The system that makes you human. The system that connects you to every other person you will ever love. The system that, if enough of us protect it and grow it, will decide what kind of civilization the next generation inherits. Tend the garden. Not because it will be easy, because it is the only thing that matters. If this video changed the way you understand empathy, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need this message most. Subscribe if you want more content that pulls back the curtain on the psychology of connection, feeling, and human nature at its deepest levels. And in the comments below, I want to know, where do you fall on the empathy spectrum? Do you feel too much, too little, or somewhere in the middle? And what practices have helped you tend your own garden? Your reflection could be exactly what someone else needed to hear. In my next video, I'm going to reveal the science of manipulation resistance, the specific psychological practices that make a person functionally immune to the tactics we have covered throughout this series. Not through paranoia, not through suspicion, through the quiet cultivation of an inner stability that manipulators cannot penetrate. You do not want to miss it. Until then, stay awake, stay aware. And remember, the world is not made better by the people who understand it most. It is made better by the people who feel it most. Be one of them. The garden is waiting.